More love for the puny space elves this week. We're going to build something that is inspired by and is similar to, but definitely not the same as, an Eldar Wraithlord. A couple weeks ago I made this guide and posted it. You can pause and read it if you want, but this is how I come up with all the specific dimensions that I'm about to give you. I want my scratch builds to be the same size as their real-world model in the interest of fidelity. We'll start by making the legs. Cut a length of drinking straw 60mm long with the bendy part in the middle of it. For the hip connection we're going to use a gear-like bead, so chop off some of the straw to account for the width of that bead so that the leg is still 60mm. Now inject the straw with hot glue on both ends. Don't need to fill it completely, just get a bunch in there. For the foot, take some thin cardstock and measure out a rectangle 6mm wide and 18mm long, and then 2 narrow triangles along the 2 long ends like you see here. Cut it out and fold the triangles. Then hot glue the longer end of the straw into the foot, making sure to position it at a slight angle depending on how far forward you want the figure to lean. Then chop a couple thin cardboard strips about 1/4 inch wide and hot glue them so they wrap over the foot like this. Now inject more hot glue into a straw and then chop a piece that is 13mm long. Hot glue the legs together with it. And then chop a 5mm long piece and hot glue it to the center, pointing upwards. For the main torso, from extruded polystyrene, otherwise known as home insulation, available at your local home improvement store, cut a block that is 18mm wide across the chest, 15mm tall from neck down, and 15mm deep from front of chest to back. And then on the front, which would be the chest, taper it twice, like this. At this point I hot glued the feet to my 60mm base, which I made using my 3D printer, although chipboard or other very heavy cardstock will do just fine. And then hot glue the torso to the leg assembly. Now from dollar store foam board, cut a piece that is 30mm wide and 16mm tall. And then from that rectangle, chop away some pieces until it looks something like this. And hot glue it to the back of the torso. For these wing-like things on the back, I just used chipboard, and I measured a rectangle 40mm tall and 17mm wide. And within that rectangle, I just freehand drew based on the picture. Make 2. Cut them out and hot glue to the back of the torso. Onto the head. Here's an earring. This is just some cheap costume jewelry. I'm going to break off the pin from the back and then hot glue this to a strip of chipboard. And then cut a triangle out of some foam and hot glue that on as well. This is intended to approximate the shape of the head. Now let's make the sword. Here's some very small beads which fit tightly onto a toothpick. So I cut a toothpick 20mm long and slide the beads onto both ends. And then on some chipboard, again I just freehand drew the blade, 50mm long. Cut it out and hot glue it to the hilt. Arms. The arms are 35mm long. Cut a drinking straw to 35mm, but unlike the legs, don't center the bendy part. Instead, there should be 10mm on one side of the bendy, and then just measure off 35 from that mark. This short 10mm side is the upper arm, and the longer side is the lower arm, which will ultimately connect to the hand. So hot glue another connecting bead to the upper arm, and then hot glue that to the torso. Remember to bend the right arm and keep the left one mostly straight. As for the hand holding the sword, chop a 5mm long piece of drinking straw, cut it open lengthwise, add some hot glue in there, and then insert the sword. Then hot glue the entire thing to the arm. Now I'm not going to belabor the next phase. I used thin 60-pound cardstock, the stuff that I always use for corrugation cladding, and cut small pieces to wrap around various parts of the model, simulating armor plating. Refer to the source image and just let your imagination guide you. I recommend cutting squares that are 3/4 inch, and from there round the corners or bevel them or do whatever you want to. But I found that 3/4 of an inch was good for wrapping partially around the drinking straw. And now the good part. The bright lance. The overall length of the bright lance is 60mm. So I injected a straw with hot glue, cut a taper on one end, and then shoved in this kind of elongated bead. Note how the hot glue makes the straw conform to the shape of the bead, because it's so hot, and that's nice for hiding the seam. Then a T-shape from foam board, hot glue that to the bead. And lastly, a smaller oval-shaped bead mounted on top for this site. Hot glue the whole thing to the back torso piece on the figure's left. And moving on to painting. Again, I'm not going to belabor this, we've done this a lot on the channel. I'm going to base in white because I'm going to be using red, and a white base coat makes it much easier to get a solid coverage of red. So then base in red, hit the joints with black, and the head with white. Probably you'll need multiple coats. And as I've done dozens of times before, flock the base with pebbles and sand and then paint. See episode 57 for this particular ground scheme. And lastly, the banner between the legs. I made this in Photoshop as described in episode 9. Just going to attach it to the crossbar between the legs using a tiny amount of Loctite Gel Control Superglue. And here it is in context next to the dreadnought we did in episode 54. And you can see I also did some random white accents all over the place. Again, just drawing inspiration from the source image. Not exact recreation, just inspiration. I also superglued a small green Swarovski crystal to the sight on the bright lance. I am Wylock, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.